Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, where I focus on our nation's large safety net programs and how free markets and strong families can best fight poverty and foster economic mobility and opportunity. As many of all of you in this room know, the first step in fighting poverty is understanding it. Who is poor, where, why, and how. And in order to fight poverty, we need to understand it deeply, identify its roots, and design policies and foster cultures that target poverty at its core. To that end, knowing what Americans earn and what material wealth they have is critical. One cannot honestly assess and improve any poverty policy without understanding what Americans earn and what they currently receive from public assistance. We at AEI are very lucky to play a small role in the work of Dr. Bruce Meyer, whose research has become so essential to the field of poverty studies. Today, he will present his new data set, whose purpose is spelled out in its name. It is the Comprehensive Guide to the Financial State of Americans. How much of that is due to earned income, how much is due to government assistance, and how much is due to government assistance. I believe Bruce Meyer's work will become the gold standard of income and poverty measurements. So let me first introduce Bruce, who will present his Comprehensive Income Dataset project, its findings, and some of its implications. Dr. Meyer is a visiting scholar here at AEI, where he focuses on poverty, inequality, and social safety net programs. Concurrently, he is the McCormick Foundation Professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He is also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has advised the United States Department of Labor and the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, authored many book chapters, and been published in various academic journals, including the Journal of Labor Economics, where he was editor. After Dr. Meyer's presentation, we will hear from a really outstanding panel who come from at this issue in a very distinguished and experienced way and from different perspectives. Stacy Dean, Ben Harris, and Robert Muffett will join us, and they will offer their responses on observations and critiques. But for now, Dr. Meyer. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for the very kind introduction. And I should emphasize that Robert was important at the beginning of this project, as I'll hopefully mention in a minute. Government statisticians and researchers inside and outside government use income to assess the functioning of the economy and the well-being of Americans. They look at indicators like mean income, poverty, inequality, and who receives what government benefits. Because of the similarity of interests between myself and people at Census, I got involved in this project. I'm working with people at Census and directing a team of outside researchers that is working with census data. What we're building is what we call the Comprehensive Income Dataset, or affectionately the KID. And it will bring together income information from many sources and related information on program receipt and consumption. Because it's a joint project with Census, I have to emphasize that what I'm saying is not necessarily the opinions of the Census Bureau. They're my opinions. And all the results that I'm going to show you, limited results, have been through disclosure review to prevent the disclosure of personal information. So what are we bringing together in this project? The idea is to combine three types of data: information from surveys, information from tax records, and information from program records, each of these sources has advantages. Surveys, I'd argue, are what we know, most of what we know about in social science from. And they target a random sample of the population. They have rich information about families, and they're a flexible platform on which all kinds of questions can be added. Tax data have very accurate information on some things. They have broad coverage of the American population, especially when you include information returns, which are records that financial institutions, government institutions, employers provide to the government. And program data, the third source, provide a lot of detailed information about benefit amounts received and timing that one can't really get from surveys, though we try with mixed results at best, as I'll describe in a minute. What are the goals of this project? We want to improve Census Bureau surveys, improve tax administration, and provide the information that we need to examine public policies and support research. Now, why do we need to combine these three sources of data? The problem is that each of the sources on its own has fundamental flaws. So let me start with surveys, because as I said, I think we know most of what we know from surveys. The problem with surveys is increasingly people don't want to participate in surveys. When you ask someone to participate, they say no. When you get to sensitive questions like income, they say, I don't want to answer that question. And when you do get an answer, which turns out to be the biggest problem, you get an inaccurate answer increasingly. Now, we don't really know, I would say, why this pattern is happening. Most of the examination of that question is looked at declining response rates to surveys. The kinds of things that are hypothesized are people are increasingly busy. They're more distrustful of government. They're more worried about their privacy. Now, I look at those explanations and I'm not quite sure to what extent those things have really changed over time. While I'm not going to emphasize it in this talk, my preferred explanation is that people are over-surveyed. Now, when you buy something online, when you visit the doctor, when you get your car repaired, you get surveyed. If you pick up the phone, it's likely to be someone surveying you. And I think people used to be excited to have someone ask them about their lives. Now, there are plenty of opportunities for people to tell people. So how can we tell that the quality of responses has gotten worse over time? One of the key ways is that we can look at the reporting of government benefits. And it turns out that the reporting of government benefits is particularly bad in most surveys. What we can do is we can compare the weighted totals of what's reported in a survey to what the government said they paid out. For different programs, for different surveys, we can do this over time. And this will give us a net reporting rate, because there may be some people who say they received even though they truly didn't, and that could cancel out people who were recipients and didn't report it. So in a way, this really understates the problem of reporting by true recipients. So what I've done is calculate the proportional bias in the dollars or months that appear in a survey. And it's this fairly simple equation. It's just, in the case of dollars, the dollars reported in the survey weighted up using the survey weights to represent the entire country, and then you divide by all the dollars that the government said they paid out. And then you subtract 1, because that ratio should be 1, and then the difference is the bias. If there's underreporting, you'll get a number less than 1. Okay, and you can do the same thing for months. Well, what do we get when we do this? And I'm going to show you this for 5 different surveys among the most used, most important surveys. And for, I think it's 9 different government transfer programs. So let me explain the upper left number, the minus 0.519 number. That's for the ACS, or American Community Survey, our biggest survey that replaced the census long form. And the column is for TANF, our cash program mostly for single mothers. And the minus 0.519 means that 52% of the dollars paid out were missed in the American Community Survey. And if you go down that column, you'll see that the first entry under months is for the CPS, or Current Population Survey, which is our source of official income and poverty statistics. The minus 0.453 there means that 45% of the months were missing from that survey, months of receipt of TANF. And those numbers aren't atypical. You see lots of pretty substantial big negative numbers in this table. We also know that there's a lot of underreporting in household surveys of benefits from other methods. We can take the individual records from a government program like SNAP or TANF and link them to household survey records, to the actual individuals and families that received the benefits. And I've done that for public assistance using New York data that Robert was instrumental in the Census Bureau obtaining about 10 years ago, maybe even more. And that's one of the starts on this project, which has been going on for a long time at a low level. And when you take those data for public assistance from New York and link it to the CPS, you find that 60%, more than 60% of those that are receiving public assistance in the CPS don't report it. And more than 40% of those in the survey of income and program participation that are receiving the benefits don't report them. And I should say that I don't want to indicate that it's always the respondent that's in error here. It may be that the interviewer is rushed and skips over questions because they're trying to get as much information out of a busy respondent as possible, and they may take some shortcuts. And it's not just program receipt that's not reported well. There's work by people at Census that finds that about half of people receiving pensions don't report the receipt of those pensions in 2 of our major surveys. I find this just completely baffling because it's regular monthly payments in most cases that aren't being reported. So it's, I was surprised by that result, even having seen so many of these studies looking at underreporting of transfer benefits. So that's the difficulty with survey data and why we need other sources of information. What about tax data? Well, tax data lack important characteristics of households. They're not designed to tell you about education or age or race. They also lack information on things that aren't taxable, which include in-kind benefits that we increasingly use as methods of supporting the resources of the poor. So you miss SNAP, Medicaid, housing benefits. You also miss cash benefits that aren't taxable, like TANF, workers' comp, veterans benefits. And tax unit really isn't the unit that you care about. You really care about, or I think as a researcher, you'd care about the unit that shares resources. And a tax unit isn't necessarily a family or another unit that shares resources. Program data, our third source, usually just gives you a slice of information that's useful for administering the program, but doesn't tell you many of the things that you'd like to know about households and their overall circumstances. So what are we going to bring together in this project? In the first phase, we're going to bring together information from 3 household surveys, the CPS, the SIP, which is really the best survey to measure income. The CPS is our official source. And then the ACS is our best source to look at small geographic areas because it's our biggest household survey. Tax data in the first phase, which are just extracts from 1040s, just a few of the variables from 1040 returns, not all of the information, and a few information returns. Really quite limited but very helpful, vital tax data. And then in terms of programs, we're bringing together program information from the Social Security information on OASDI and SSI, from HUD on public and subsidized housing programs, from HHS on Medicaid, Medicare, and TANF. Finally, we get data from the states on TANF, General Assistance, SNAP, WIC, and LIHEAP, but there it's for selected states. We expect, and we're in the process of moving into phase 2, where we'll also have consumption data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, better 1040 extracts and more complete information returns, veterans benefits. Carla Medaglia, who's one of the co-authors on this project, was talking with the Veterans Administrations yesterday. And then we hope to get more information from the states on SNAP, WIC, LIHEAP, more TANF data, and some workers' comp data. But we realize that, at least in the short run, it's not going to be all states. How do we put these data together? We link them using an anonymized version of the SSN called a PIC, or Protected Identification Key. And the administrative records usually have SSNs, and those are converted to this anonymized form of the SSN, so we don't actually see a person's social security number. The survey data doesn't have SSNs, but the Census Bureau uses information from the Social Security Administration and IRS to assign an SSN to individuals based on their name, address, and date of birth. And the method is quite successful and accurate. Depending on the survey, the year, 90 to 97% of households get at least one of these identifiers attached to them. What measure of income are we going to focus on? It's really important that we include all sources of income. Otherwise, you don't get a full picture of people's circumstances. And increasingly, we use in-kind transfers and tax credits to redistribute income. So let me show you a quick figure. The bottom line is real spending, cash transfers for TANF. And then the orange line is the spending on SNAP. And then the gray line is the EITC. And you can see that while cash spending has gone down in this example, there's been a huge increase in what we spend in kind or through tax credits. So it's essential that you account for those if you want to get a picture of how people are doing at the bottom. There are also some real issues in how to measure some of the in-kind benefits. And the ones that I list on this slide, there are papers written just on how to measure those benefits and account for them. And I will say our work on figuring out how to incorporate those is in process. And people will disagree on how you should measure these, and in the end we'll probably report many different measures because there won't be universal agreement on how you should, say, account for health benefits. For now, we're looking at recent years, but we hope to go back in time because people are especially interested in how things have changed over time. We have pretty good data going back to about 2000, but even going back just that far, we lose a lot of our state information, so we will need to impute it to come up with an educated guess for some of the state benefits like state-administered benefits like SNAP and TANF, but we will have the best information that's ever been available to predict those missing benefits, since we'll have administrative data from later years linked to those surveys. What will we use all these data for? Well, first, I mentioned earlier survey improvement. We're going to need to assess the extent and nature of errors. We're going to figure out how to impute, predict essentially cases where people didn't report particular items like benefits. Will substitute administrative values for survey ones in some cases. And this project has the potential to show how one can substitute administrative values for survey ones and thus reduce the burden in surveys to no longer asking lots of questions about things that the government already knows, and then allowing respondents and interviewers to focus on the things that one can't obtain another way. In terms of tax administration and policy making, I know there's a lot of interest at the IRS in understanding EITC take-up and identifying areas where there's non-compliance with the tax system. This data set will also be much better for simulating the effects of tax changes than anything that we have out there. And there are all kinds of organizations around government and outside government, including AEI, that simulates the effects of tax and program changes. And this data set would be the ideal source for those kinds of exercises. Lastly, in terms of research, these data that we're putting together would be far and away the best source to look at income distribution, poverty, and inequality, and the effects of social insurance and mean-tested transfers. Where are we in this project so far? Well, I've obtained 3 years of funding for it, and we're working on initial projects to show the proof of concept. We're busy assembling the data, documenting it, trying to figure out where there are weaknesses in the data, and spending a lot of time assessing the quality of the data. We've done some initial projects that are focused in significant part on understanding the data quality and solving some of the methodological issues. So we're examining how well Census Bureau surveys cover the population, studying the different sources of error, and examining the reasons people misreport in surveys. We're also starting some of the more substantive projects. And I should say that what we're doing at this point is really work in progress, because we expect to get better data over time, and we expect to learn more about how to use the data. Many of the data sources that we're using haven't been really studied, and they certainly haven't been put together and cross-referenced. So we expect this to be a process, and we're starting out, I will say, with some of the things that I thought were maybe lower stakes or were useful for us to learn about the data. And this first project that I want to show you one figure from looks at the poverty reduction due to Social Security and means-tested transfers. And we consider this really a worst-case scenario for our project, because we're looking at the best measured survey data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And in an important way, it's atypical because it's already been replaced with a redesigned survey that the National Academy of Sciences, in a report, has said is not nearly as good for looking at transfers to low-income individuals and for studying the low-income population in general as the survey version that we're looking at here. Okay, so let me explain this figure. What it shows is the poverty reduction in the survey and administrative data combined. So when we take our 3 sources of data, put them together, and look at the poverty reduction from various programs, here 4 different programs: Social Security, food stamps, SSI, and public assistance. We look at these poverty reductions in our improved data compared to what you would get from the survey. And if you get the same thing, you would be right on that dashed line. Okay? And the points to the left are where the survey understates the poverty reduction, and the points to the right of that line are where the survey overstates the poverty reduction of the program. And we do this for different demographic groups. What you can quickly see is that there are a lot of triangles to the right, and that says that the survey data overstate the effect of SSI on poverty reduction for most groups. And we know why that happens because a lot of people confuse OASDI, Social Security Retirement, for SSI in reporting on in the SIP and in other surveys. But you'll notice that there are a lot of squares to the left of that dashed line, which says that public assistance, TANF and general assistance, are dramatically understated in terms of their poverty reduction. And you can see that the extent of bias from just using the survey data varies quite a bit across type of household. The second early study that I want to show you some results from looks at the extent of extreme poverty in the U.S. And here it's defined to be less than $2 a day per person. And there have been some recent claims. You may have heard about UN report that was released, I guess last week, that talked about extreme poverty. And those analyses are generally starting with the measure of poverty, extreme poverty, at the far left here. And I'm showing it here for different household types. So that highest line with the triangles is single parents, and then the orange squares is single individuals without children. And what you see is that when you make various adjustments to the extreme poverty rate, accounting for problems with the data, and then the last 2 adjustments are based on tax data, that's where we've joined tax and program and survey data. You can see that those last steps make quite a difference, so that you get a very different view of the extent of extreme poverty, of people living on less than $2 a day, when you incorporate the combination of survey, tax, and program data. So what are our future plans? We expect that researchers besides us will be able to get access to these data in the near future through federal statistical research data centers, where they would be able to securely access the data, and any numbers that are taken out would have to go through disclosure review to make sure that personal identifying information is not revealed. We expect to work with federal and state agencies to design products that they might find useful from these data. And we hope that in the long run, the Census Bureau will permanently adopt this project as their own. So let me stop there.
I'm very, very happy that the group that we've assembled to comment and discuss Bruce's work is so outstanding, and are all people that I've admired and had the benefit of learning from for a long time. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. I'll do the introduction first, and then I'll say something, and then we'll have each of the people respond. So directly to my right is Stacy Dean, who is the Vice President for Food Assistance Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She directs the Center's Food Assistance Team, which publishes frequent reports on how federal nutrition programs affect families and communities, and develops policies to improve them. Ms. Dean has testified before Congress and spoken extensively to national and state nonprofit groups. She is a leading voice on these issues in Washington. After Bruce is Ben Harris, who is the Chief Economist and Senior Advisor at Results for America, and the former Chief Economist and Economic Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. He is also a visiting associate professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Business. He was previously the policy director of the Hamilton Project, a fellow in economic studies at Brookings, and a deputy director of Retirement Security Project at Brookings as well. And then finally on my far right is Robert Moffett, who is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Economics at Johns Hopkins University's Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He also holds a joint appointment at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And before teaching at Johns Hopkins, he was a professor of economics at Brown. These are outstanding participants in the public debate about poverty and economic opportunity in the United States, and I'm very glad that all of you are here. I have to just say one thing about my background. So I was a public administrator of benefit programs, and part of the reason that I react to this is that when I was in New York City or New York State, we were delivering assistance to individuals and families that provided a substantial amount of aid. I used to say the agency that I ran provided more assistance to more New Yorkers than any other institution in the city, and that was true. But then every year, the Census Bureau would produce reports that didn't match up with what I thought we were doing to help individuals in the city. So that's the perspective that I come from, and I think some of you might share that perspective, but you're going to have a slightly different perspective. And so what I asked is that Ben will talk about it sort of from the global economic, macroeconomic perspective of someone who's served on the Council of Economic Advisor. Robert Moffett will talk about it from the sort of long-term study of poverty in America, which he is, a giant in. And then Stacy will address the policy implications for those of us who try to get Congress to do the right thing, depending on how we look at it. So let's start with you, Ben, and then Robert, and then Stacy.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. This is an incredibly interesting and honestly remarkable effort by Bruce. My initial reaction, which dominates all the reactions, is that this is just a dizzying, just overwhelming effort, and I cannot imagine taking it on, and I'm thrilled that you have. From an empirical standpoint, this is just a huge lift, and it's terrific that someone is doing it. So that's my initial reaction. Everything else is minor, but because I can't just say that and walk out the door, I'm going to go on the other minor stuff. So if you've read Bruce's JEP paper from 2015, he makes a really compelling case that survey data is fraught. And not only is it fraught, but it's getting worse. So for example, if you look at non-response, which is just one of the dimensions of the problems with survey data in the Consumer Expenditure Survey, between the mid-'80s and 2013, the non-response went from 15% to over 30%. So it doubled, more than doubled. So it's getting worse, and I don't think there's any reason to think that trend's not continuing. Which sort of begs the question, should we even be thinking about survey data at all? You know, when you start looking at the non-response, and if you start looking at the trajectory of non-response, not just non-response, but mismeasurement and all the other problems, you know, should we just forget about survey data? We used to have to rely on survey data. We didn't have a ton of other alternatives, but now a lot has changed in the world of data, and maybe, you know, if you sort of started today, should we just be thinking about only administrative data? This is just a question. But on administrative data, you know, thinking about this, one question that I had is, you know, there's also administrative data bias. Administrative data is not always exactly right. So, for example, there's this researcher named Seth Stevens-Davidowitz. He's a writer for the New York Times. He's a PhD in economics. He wrote this book called Everybody Lies, where he looked at Google data. And he showed that during the recession, and this is a working paper, it's not published, I don't think, but during the recession, that if you just looked at administrative data, it looked like child maltreatment rates were going down. They're going down by a lot. But then he showed, based on sort of Google searches and other non-administrative data sources, that that they were actually doubling during the recession. So administrative data, like survey data, can sometimes be biased. Now, I think in general, administrative data, you've just got to put a ton more faith in it than survey data, but it's not always exactly right. A second reaction I had is that when it comes to taxes, I think that the linked data that Bruce is doing is even more important. So I had a hard time looking up the change in non-filers doing the TCJA. There was one report that showed that the share of non-filers is going up by about 3 percentage points. But because we have the doubling of the standard deduction, I think there's suggestive that it will have more non-filers going forward. So this type of research is getting even more important. So not just because of what's happening with survey, non-response, and mismeasurement error, but what's going on in the tax code means that what Bruce is doing is even more important. One thing that I worry about a little bit is quality data bias. So I'm the chief economist of a group called Results for America. We're a bipartisan group. Robert's a senior fellow. And we advocate for evidence-based policy. So we advocate basically for putting in place infrastructures for governments at all levels to evaluate policy. And speaking from Results for America, we are just thrilled with this effort. But, you know, so you do worry a bit about programs that can be evaluated being favored over those that just can't be evaluated. I mean, maybe there are some really good programs or good policies that that we just don't have the data for, and maybe so we sort of get this quality data bias. You know, maybe there are these interventions that are really promising that we can't evaluate, and there are others that we can evaluate, and we're pushing them more just towards the ones we can, just because we can. Does that make sense? Coming out of my mouth, it sounds more confusing than. Yeah. But the point is that if there's promising evaluations that we can't, or promising interventions we can't evaluate, maybe we're moving too far away from those. So just a thought. And lastly, let me say, so one thing I worry a lot about with this, I worry a lot about the tax gap. And like nothing's perfect, and Bruce just can't I don't think this effort can get at the tax gap. The tax gap, for those, I suspect most people know, but it's the difference between taxes owed and taxes paid. IRS does its best. You know, we're talking about money that's owed to the IRS, so it's not really knowable. The last estimate they had put it about close to, in real terms, close to $500 billion. It's huge. And most of this is due to individual tax non-payment. On the business side, you have about $125 billion. On the when it comes to the employment tax, the payroll tax, you have about $80 billion. So here's something that I worry a lot about. And so, you know, you've got this $500 billion a year non-payment. And so, you know, I sort of do worry about if we start to know a ton about transfer programs, but we don't know a lot about what's going on in the tax code, about what's not being paid. That just seems like a bias that we should be a little bit concerned about. And that's not saying that we shouldn't move forward with all this great information about the transfer programs. It means we should begin to learn a lot more about tax noncompliance. So I'll stop there, but and the last thing I'll say, I thought this was sort of interesting, which is that you know, when it comes to some of the really great studies that we've seen, particularly in public finance out of the past few years, many of them have just been from terrific administrative data. So I do a lot of work in retirement security. One of the most important retirement security papers written in the past few years is by Raj Chetty and by John Friedman, and they used data from Denmark, where they had 41 million observations from 4 million people from Denmark. And Denmark just collects really good data on income, and not just good data on income, but great data on wealth too. So they collect data on wealth to check whether or not the income data is right. And because Denmark had such a terrific effort in collecting administrative data, they could write this paper which told us with a fairly high degree of precision about the impact of retirement saving incentives. You have the Raj Chetty work, which was obviously just based on tax data, which is a form of administrative data. I think that's one of the more important papers on mobility that we've seen coming out of the past few years. And so that sort of goes to my point, like, should we be thinking maybe about just moving away from administrative data altogether? And I suspect, given that you've had such a huge lift, your answer will be no, Bruce. And I'm not suggesting that, but I think it's a question worth considering.
Robert?
Sorry, moving away from survey
data.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Let me just second what Ben said, which is that I think this is a tremendous project and incredibly valuable. And no one's quite done this before at this level of ambition to link as many data sets, as many administrative data sets as Bruce and his colleagues are doing. There have been quite a number of studies by Bruce and other people in the past of linking maybe one data set, one administrative data set, to different survey data sets like the CPS or the SIP or others. But to obtain as many as Bruce has done is incredibly valuable, and I'm looking forward to further results that come out of his project. I should also say that lest any of you be misled, there's a lot of work and sweat that goes into this at the detailed level. Bruce is too modest to describe that, although maybe it's kind of hinted at by some of his slides. But it is really difficult. And also there are a lot of technical issues in doing this. When you get down to the nitty-gritty, a lot of assumptions that you have to make. Maybe in the discussion period we can get into some of the technical issues. I'm not going to do that in what I'm going to talk about. And we also, I see in the audience, have a number of people who are also pretty expert on the technical issues of linking and matching. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. I'm also not going to say too much, but maybe in the discussion period I can, about the implications and uses of Bruce's work for program evaluation and evaluating the impact of programs, and particularly on things like improving the labor force and labor market skills, manpower training programs, education programs, and things like that. That's a topic I have something to say on. I'll postpone. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one very broad 10,000-foot level policy implication that I take from Bruce's work and this work and past work, and Stacy may be talking about this as well. And then I'm going to make one point about my belief of where the real importance of this work is and how it will be useful in the future, where it can be used. So first of all, in the very broadest policy implication here, those of you who in the audience are very knowledgeable know this, but there's a long-standing puzzle, I would say, in the impact of social welfare programs and safety net programs on the level of poverty, which is that for many, many years, since the late 60s and early 70s, social welfare spending in the United States has grown. Contrary to some beliefs, it has never really fallen. We haven't had retractionary periods. There are some programs which have shrunk, but overall, per capita spending on low-income families in the United States, when you aggregated all of our programs, has grown steadily at different rates and different times, but is still going up today. Despite that, over really most researchers who are computing poverty rates for many, many years found really stagnant poverty rates, no decline in poverty. It went down a lot in the early 70s, and then all of the numbers showed flat. All the way up to the 70s, the 80s. And despite this great increase in social welfare spending, well, there's been some work done on that, and Bruce has contributed to this, showing that the problem was that the federal definition of poverty and what was counted as income, and the Census Bureau was not counting any of the really big growth social welfare programs like SNAP, which is tremendous growth, not the EITC, any of these important programs. And when you include those, indeed, the poverty rate has, in fact, gone down. So it was just a measurement problem, and the Census Bureau was not computing the right number. Bruce has contributed to this. If you look at his Brookings paper on economic activity, the title of which was something like Winning on War on Poverty. In fact, we've made a real dent in poverty rates with social welfare spending. And when you include these other programs, you see that. Now, with this work, not only to today's work that Bruce presented, but his work in the past few years, is showing that, in fact, the impact is even greater than we thought, namely that there's tremendous underreporting of transfer benefits, and in fact, the impact of these programs on poverty is even greater than we thought. So my broadest takeaway is this is just confirming and reinforcing this fact that safety net spending does reduce poverty. And I should hasten to say that doesn't mean we can't improve programs. There are a lot of good reforms we can do in those. And also, I'm not saying anything about behavioral response, which maybe we can talk about, because Bruce mentions as a caveat to all these studies. But I do think that's a broad takeaway here that should be accepted and understood. The contrary, obviously, is that if we want to reform these programs, simply cutting them is going to increase poverty by more than we thought now that we understand the impact, the greater impact that they actually have. So that's one very broad point, and I'd be happy for people in the audience or on the panel to comment on that perspective. What about the uses of this? Well, I hope Bruce will continue this. I hope other people will. What's the future of this work? Bruce has been working on this for 10 or 15 years as it is. The difficulties in actually doing this linking, and I don't mean the technical difficulties, but actually getting permission to link is very, there are high hurdles in that. And even if you're inside government, and there are people here in the audience who are currently or have been members of the administration involved in this, getting another agency to give you the data and linking it to your survey is very difficult. Both legal issues and practical issues are involved in that. It would be very nice if in the next decade or two, almost every federal survey could link to as many data sets as we have here. My belief is the probability that will happen, even in 10 years, much less 20, on a very broad spectrum is quite low. Not to mean that we shouldn't continue to make the efforts, both those on the outside, like Bruce, as well as those in the federal government. However, one thing that could be done much more quickly is use these results for imputation and imputation to surveys. And Bruce mentions this as one of the possible uses. To me, that's the most important, practical, fairly immediate use. And by imputation, what I mean is you go to the federal surveys that are out there now, and you use the results to figure out if somebody reports X, they're really getting Y. And this informs that, and you can use these data to improve the distribution statistics you get out of other surveys. In fact, a lot of people are working on improving imputation methods. The Census Bureau is making some major efforts over the past few years to improve their methods of imputation to several of their federal surveys. It's a very active area of research. A lot of research economists like me and universities have worked on improving imputation methods. To me, this work could be invaluable in that, and it wouldn't take a lot of effort to do. I hope that I would like to see Bruce and his team participate in that effort by providing the kind of statistics that a federal survey can use to do imputation, given the misreports and underreports and overreports that he's documented. So let me leave it there, and we can have discussion of this and other issues during the discussion period.
Stacy?
Thanks, Robert, and thank you very much for having me here today. This is a terrific work, great panel. I have to say, Bob Moffat's work was required reading when I worked for Bell Sawhill in the mid-90s working on welfare reform, so it's really a pleasure to be here on a panel with him. So the papers, the work, the presentation, like everyone else, I just want to reflect my profound appreciation for the work that you've done here. At the center, we work in administrative data and survey data. Basically, if it's out there, we are working in it, and you can get 10 people in a room, and all of us disagree on what the number of people who receive a benefit are, or what its impact are, just because of the differences that we see. And so the idea of pulling the pieces together in a single comprehensive look, at least an annual look, and we should talk about that, would advance our work, I think, really appreciably, and just because of all of the survey work that we do, also with state longitudinal surveys, I have a deep personal appreciation of how much this probably required of you and your team, so thank you. So look, given the construct of the way that we deliver benefits through different sets of programs, also through the tax system, the different layers of government, which we also elect to provide them through local, state, and federal, coupled with, I think, a lack of sufficient investment in adequate national survey data, we really don't have the best, robust, comprehensive appreciation of what the safety net does. So it leaves those of us who work in this space, I think, with an unsatisfying picture of the details, and I would imagine for policymakers who are deciding where to invest or where to make changes, that it can be a frustrating experience because they can't jump across 5 or 6 surveys the way that those of us who live in that space can. But just to be clear, the paper, and I agree with Bob's take, the paper and all of the work doesn't change the fact that we do know, even though the details on the specifics have been off, and I look forward to the correction, the safety net has an enormous impact on changing the lives of people living below the poverty line. It is transferring income to those who are struggling on a monthly and annual basis. It lifts tens of millions of people out of poverty, and each program does that in a different amount for different groups, and I think it's really important and crucial to get to a better measurement of that and a consistent measurement of that, and I think a shared understanding of the measure. But in that space, in that perspective, we're talking about refinement. So I think to the extent that the data set helps us to come to a common understanding here in DC and in state capitals around the world that the safety net is making a difference, that would be terrific. So I had a couple of technical thoughts, some of which we can save for discussion, and then some thoughts about how the information could be used by policymakers. I think I'm here as along with Robert, a policy-oriented consumer rather than an academic-oriented consumer. So I may have reacted and gotten excited about opportunities from a different perspective. So quickly, just on some smaller things that we can talk about, I did notice in some of the presentation on the papers that the poverty line is set forth as the standard under which the over-under, right? It is just the metric of success, and I think it isn't the only metric that policy officials use. SNAP's purpose is not to reduce poverty, although it does a phenomenal job at doing that. It is to help families purchase food or to increase their monthly purchasing power. In fact, it wasn't designed to think about it as what its impact was over the course of a year. So I think thinking about what are some other possible metrics that could help inform decision makers would be useful. I also think that the targeting question isn't always the notion that some programs target to those below or above. The fact that the EITC generally targets to people above the poverty line was in fact core to its design. So it isn't a failing that it is more oriented towards folks closer to the line than below. So it's, I think, and certainly in the beginning of the paper, you lay all of that very clearly. But if we only have these two particular metrics, which I think are very relevant in academia and over the course of assessing annual income, that makes sense. But for policymakers, they're thinking a little bit differently. I definitely think for some of the programs we should talk about, get input from policy experts on why some of the variance is there. So for example, on housing, our housing team wondered if people were responding, where you recognize there was an overcount, were they acknowledging the low-income tax credit, potentially thinking that was their housing assistance. Therefore, the imputation could be off, and just it didn't jive very much with administrative data. So we're delighted to talk to you about that, but I think also for a policy audience, you want to make sure that we understand why it's off or try to correct given what we know about the evidence of what exists out there. I was also very interested about your zero income slide, and that I know that's work that's forthcoming, and whether that was annual or monthly, because of course the SIP data, which the paper illustrated, I think your data aligned pretty well with, shows in fact that we do have a significant number of zero income households, although obviously it's very small overall. So those were two, housing and zero income were examples of things that didn't feel quite right, and so just sorting that out will be hugely beneficial to helping policy officials accept and use the information as you move forward. In terms of some of the big questions that I'm really excited about, thinking about how could the data be used moving forward, obviously more accurately capturing the scope of the problem and the scope and impact of the solution in terms of the safety net, getting to more of a shared understanding there, I think, is terrific and will help advance all of our work. The what works question, what is most powerful with respect to addressing poverty, again, on an annual basis. Also, what wouldn't work, right? Or what would be the impact of negative changes? Again, terrific data set to use there. I was very excited about the charts that you teased us with on impacts on subgroups. Because the safety net works differently for different populations, we saw it for different particular demographics like seniors or single-headed households. I also think it's useful to think, if possible, if you get the power regionally or by state type. So, for example, a state with a more generous safety net versus one with a less generous safety net. That could also help illustrate the power of the transfer. And the weight or how you think about where the next dollar goes should also be thought about of the impact on the people who get the benefit. Housing appears very diluted in it, or not particularly powerful in its impact, but very few people actually get housing relative to SNAP or Social Security. Of those who get it, it's probably a much more powerful anti-poverty intervention than SNAP. And so that might help inform the next dollar potentially should be invested in housing. As an anti-hunger advocate, I couldn't possibly say that over SNAP, but one might want to consider that as a possibility. And of course, the combinations, which again, policy officials might want to know, SNAP plus EITC has this kind of impact, and we really want to lean into that outreach. That caseworkers at the local level could be moved to understand how different combinations could help affect their clients. So I think all of these things are it's the kind of work that we're doing now, but we're doing across 5 or 6 different data sets. So the idea of having it in one place, I think, really matters. A key, and my last thought is, this issue that Robert raised, which was, I know how much I gave people monthly and cumulatively over the year, but that didn't equal how census measured things on an annual basis. That is a really crucial distinction between the way I think program operators and many program policy officials think about poverty and transfer versus potentially or possibly academics. The experience that you have in a month of not being able to meet your bills, or you just experiencing hardship, and the need to respond to that is quite a different thing than thinking about families' incomes over the course of a year. And I think there's a difference between a family with 0 income for 6 months and income for another 6 months versus a family with the same annual income that's consistent over the 12. And so it's always going to be important as we think about these survey tools to keep understanding that fluctuations within the year are an important part of the story and the work that we have to do in assessing the effectiveness of the safety net. So again, thank you so much for the work that you've done here.
So thanks very much, all three of you, and I'm going to ask a couple questions, and Bruce will give you an opportunity to respond to either my thoughts or questions, and then anything you've heard from any of the panelists, if that's all right. So the first one is, I thought Ben was the bravest and boldest in saying, maybe the surveys just aren't right. And I think there's some attractiveness to that. And we still, in the general public, are relying on the surveys. And that is the public narrative that they get. And as a result, there is this belief that we haven't had as much progress as we think we have on reducing poverty. And that's unfortunate. And then we made an effort to change that with the supplemental measure. And I think what Bruce is showing is the supplemental measure tried to count the additional benefits appropriately, but it didn't count them correctly. That measure is still off, that survey effort. So I just think that, Bruce, I'd like to know whether you really feel the narrative is adversely affected by a continued reliance on the survey, and our policy implications are. And then the second question has to do, I'm a big believer in the fact that all that we've done has shored up the incomes and resources available to struggling Americans very significantly, and we should be proud of that. But I'm a little concerned about earnings. And I wanted, Bruce, you to address the extent to which you think we understand what people are earning on their own, absent any transfer payments, and what's the story there versus the poverty line. So those are some thoughts I wanted to start out with, but I wanted, Bruce, you to address that or anything else that you wanted to.
Great. This has been a terrific set of comments, and people were very kind about this project. Let me see if I can quickly go through what I thought were some of the key comments where I can say something useful. So let me go in order. So with Ben, surveys. I think we should not get rid of them, but we should trust less much of the information from them. That there's some information that we just can't get from another source. Stacy emphasized fluctuations over the year. The admin data sources that we have just won't allow us to get at that. Really, though, the only survey that allowed us to get at that was the SIP, and it was just changed in a way that makes it impossible to do that. So I guess I like the old SIP. You probably like it better too. When they asked people about their income 3 times over the year rather than just once. Let me, in terms of administrative data also having problems, you want to realize that administrative data is as diverse as survey data, maybe more. And there's good administrative data for a particular question, and even those data will probably have bad variables. And then there's administrative data that's very low quality. So if you talk about child maltreatment, that's built up from lots of individual reports, and those can be subject to a lot of error, can be subject to effects of the business cycle. Whereas if you're thinking about program records from SNAP, they're all being produced by one administrative system in a state generally, though sometimes they're counties. But hopefully they're cross-checked, they're audited. You don't have that kind of thing going on with child maltreatment. In terms of the tax gap, that was also a Ben topic. I think that that's really important. And I think that that's going to stay as one of the real problems with what we're doing, that we're going to miss a lot of self-employment income because that's particularly underreported on tax returns. But I think this project can also be useful in understanding the tax gap because we can, in linking tax records to, say, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, we can do a better job of figuring out where there is underreporting, what types of individuals, by looking at people who spend a lot more than they say they're receiving in income. So I think this project can actually get at that. In terms of Robert's comments, one comment he mentioned was on the importance of surveys having the information to be linkable, or the importance of linkage to surveys. And that's one thing that I'm trying to push hard on with the statistical agencies. One example of that is that the Consumer Expenditure Survey asks age, but not date of birth. And that means that they lose about 10% of people just by that difference, that they can't link. And adding date of birth to the survey, I think, would allow them to strengthen their data because they could bring in administrative data on income to augment their data and maybe stop asking about income and just get it administratively. Imputation, I take the point, this is really more of a technical discussion. I agree that use of these data to impute may be one of the most important uses. But I am a little concerned. I don't think people would find imputation persuasive, and I'm not sure it would be flexible enough to do things like look at zero reported households that report zero income, to figure out whether you want to impute to them, I think is a very tricky issue, and I'm not sure I could design an algorithm that people would be happy with, because in truth, a large share of the people that report zero are errors. They're zero because of the error. And so you don't want to, you sort of want the imputation method to key off that, but then that's, it's in a way could be taken to be biasing your answer tremendously. So I think that it's a little problematic. Also, in terms of zero-income households in the SIP, let me just say that there's a large share, almost 1% of people, who report zero earnings, but they report hours, they report an occupation, an industry, and when you look at other information in the survey, they're not reporting hardships. So it's clear that that's just an error. And you can see the earnings, admittedly on an annual basis, in the tax records. So, but I take the point that we really need some source where we can look at fluctuations over the year. So I think I got to everything that I wanted to.
Except Robert.
That's okay.
Except Robert. Okay, Robert.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right.
Earnings.
Earnings. I want to know about earnings.
So earnings are really, this is partly significantly a technical problem, and that one of the hardest things that we have to wrestle with is the fact that we have three sources, main sources of earnings information. We have reports and surveys, we have tax records that the IRS has, and we have quarterly employment records from the unemployment insurance system. They often disagree, and we have to figure out, is the right answer to take the max of these? If someone has, if their earnings appear in any one source.
So what you're saying is that you're getting better able to count the transfer payments than you are yet at counting earnings.
Yes.
And that's still an open question.
And I think that's one of the hardest and most important issues, and people, I think, are going to disagree on what is the right thing to do.
And just one more, I have a little obsession with the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit going to low-income households. Are you able to differentiate between the two?
We can't now. We hope to in the data that is currently right now being delivered to the Census Bureau. So the current data that the census has had, the type of data that the census has had for the last 50 years from IRS would not allow that, would not permit it, because it's just doesn't have enough information.
Okay.
So,
Ben, you're looking like you want to say. Do you want to add something?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Let's open up to questions. I got to ask one more question. So occasionally, based on what we've heard today, the phrase "our frayed safety net" becomes less and less viable. Do you agree with that? I mean, Robert said, it turns out from Bruce's work that all this effort has actually had an effect, and it's grown. Every year it steadily grows. It doesn't grow always at the same rate, but it's grown. So, again, it's the right likes to say the safety net has failed, and that's clearly not right. But the left also likes to say the safety net's frayed or problematic or not working.
Or not doing enough, I think, would be a better restatement. But but I think it's important to think about the safety net isn't universal in its response to the demographic, to the states, based on the state that you live in, and I think when, as a nominal spokesperson for the left, when you hear the notion that folks ought to be dialing up, it's typically with respect to a group or a concern where the safety net is weaker. So I think the safety net's gotten a lot stronger for earners over the past few decades. Childless adults, although with the passage of ACA, certainly offers health insurance now, but that's not a group typically eligible for cash assistance, SNAP, and in many states, health. And so you see just a different response across the board. And that, I think Bruce's work, the paper started to pull those pieces apart, but it is not a monolithic response for every individual with low income. And it's really important for us to assess its value, I think, for each group.
And that's actually, you raised another good question. Bruce, state-by-state variation on the failure of the surveys? Or
groups, I think, right? You wouldn't be able to do state-by-state.
Remember? I mean, is it uniform across the country?
We've looked a little bit at that, but not a lot. There is some variation, but and it looks like it's not explained by just who's in the state, their age and education and other demographics, but most, yeah, let me stop.
It's a consistent story. Okay, so let's open it up for questions from the audience. We have some distinguished people right here.
Okay, so
Dr. Olson?
I've heard of several problems. One is that
Use the microphone, Ed. Thank you.
I've heard several problems. One is that many and an increasing number of people are refusing to answer surveys. I've heard that some questions are consistently answered poorly. I can't help but believe that the large number of people who are not willing to fill out the surveys is because the surveys are very long. I think you alluded to that. Many of these surveys are very long. So maybe a step forward along the line that Ben was suggesting is not to have surveys at all. Maybe no one will go that far, but simply to ask fewer questions and eliminate the questions that are, are answered most poorly, and that may be a step in the right direction.
Well, or invest more to expand the survey response. You were giving an example from another country, that Denmark, right? Mm-hmm. Where there was robust response and it was
so I guess actually a substantive question is, do we know, has anyone studied the effect on the length of a survey on the response rate? That would be an interesting thing to know.
Can I ask Ed? So Denmark, good example. Sweden, Norway, these countries that collect so much data on every individual. You've got the tax data, you've got the earnings data, you've got every benefit they receive from. It's all without surveys. Okay, are you comfortable with, as an American, with having our government link every data every item they can get on you? And I'm not sure that America is going to go the Scandinavian route on this.
But we keep the surveys. Just keep the surveys to get something. Use administrative.
That's raises a question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Kelly.
By the way, I've studied that question. I don't answer long surveys. So I'm reminded of a very important paper that came out of AEI a few months ago studying retirement income surveys. And what they found was that people who took money out of IRAs and 401ks didn't count that as receiving income. They counted it as taking money out of savings. And the adjustment that came out of that paper simply dispelled half the retirement crisis in the country. It couldn't be more dramatic. So I see the same sort of thing coming out of this work potentially. However, that result was not great if you have a vested interest in there being a retirement crisis. So the question is, everyone there now on the podium is very supportive of this. I have to assume that the result is going to be it's going to show more income at lower levels. Do you think anyone of your colleagues, which there's a broad political spectrum that works on this, do you think anyone is going to push back just on the data collection, the idea of doing this?
So this is something that I wanted to mention in response to Ed and Robert's interchange. We're very mindful in this project that we're only going to focus on income sources and not bring in health information, not bring in education information, not bring in criminal justice information, at least not permanently, because we're worried that the American public would not have an appetite for that kind of concentration of information all in one place permanently. And I think that there are legitimate concerns if you have all that information in one place. So we're just in this project focused on income sources and some closely related information. But I think that it's important to always emphasize that these data are analyzed in a secure location by trained researchers. You have to go through a pretty high-level security clearance to get access to the data, and swear that you will not disclose any of the information for life. Everything that comes out of this secure location has to go through disclosure review. I try and emphasize those things because I am worried about both legitimate privacy issues and how it's perceived.
So, can I just respond? So I think you said two really interesting things. The first was you brought up retirement. So I was making a list of reasons to be excited about Bruce's work. Retirement was number 4. There are a lot of different narratives going on with retirement. You alluded to that in your comment. One is that Americans are terrible undersavers. Sometimes if you look at the asset data or wealth data, you can make that case. If you look at income data in particular, if you look at consumption data, we actually do okay. So Bruce's colleague, Eric Hurst, has a paper on consumption data in retirement. It makes us look like pretty good retirement savers. You don't see a big discontinuity at retirement. But this type of data can revolutionize what we understand about retirement. That's one reason to be excited. A second reason to be excited, Eric Rosengren yesterday at the Peterson Institute gave this speech on how we need to prepare for the next recession. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Another recession is coming. I don't know when, but it's going to come at some point. We really need to know if these programs worked, both in the last 2 recessions. And this data, we didn't talk about this, but this is really well suited for understanding countercyclical policy and answering Rosengren's call. A third reason to be excited, we've talked a little about international comparisons. I mean, there's this positive correlation between the size of the social safety net and the level of the quality of administrative data, right? Scandinavian countries have big social safety nets. They also collect really good data. And so on June 12th, the OECD came out with its sort of annual measure of comparing social safety net a share of GDP by different countries. And for the US, they use the CPS. And like anyone coming out of this presentation would say, okay, well maybe we should think about that a little bit more. And I know the U.S. will never look like Belgium, but we need to think about the CPS as a data source on those type of international comparisons. So you also asked about would anyone be opposed to it, and this was I was trying to allude a little bit to about the bias. So for example, in a few weeks I'm part of another panel. A paper coming out with Gene Sturley, the Tax Policy Center, we talk about the need to evaluate tax expenditures. Right? So we now have a $1.5 trillion annual tax expenditure budget. We don't evaluate it at all. We spent trillions on the mortgage interest reduction over the course of the past century. We have no idea if it works or not to incent home ownership. So I think if you see any opposition, it's going to be that there's this asymmetry between the information we have for transfer programs and the level of evaluation that they're being subject to, and other types of programs like preferential capital gains rates or issues with the estate tax or certain things with tax expenditures. So I think if you're going to see a blowback, it might be to this asymmetric evaluation.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. I was very interested in having done a fair bit of work in this area. And to some degree, the Census Bureau has had access to these data files and the ability to link them for a while. And what you've brought is a focus on how they can be used, what their potential value is. And there have been the panelists and other people who have asked questions about the use of these data and will they be used properly. My question is, at the Census Bureau, it's always been very difficult. It's been very opaque getting access to these data. There's a long process to apply, which has the value of protecting it, but there's no way of knowing how long it will take to get approved. There's no clear way of knowing what will get approved. The Census Bureau has traditionally applied a Title 13 standard to allowing research, which means unless they believe that there's a benefit to the Census Bureau and their programs, they don't think that they're authorized to give access to these data. And then there's the talk about can these data be used in a way that people would not like them? And that goes to reproducibility and the models. If someone builds a model, it would be nice if I can access the imputations or the model. I know I've said a lot, but I'd like you to comment on what thought have you given to making the access to these universal to people who are qualified?
You kind of set me up. I spent 1.5 years on a commission called the Commission for Evidence-Based Policymaking, which was all about recommendations to do what you are asking about. And so we issued a report with 20-some recommendations on making administrative data more widely available for researchers inside and outside government, and for better documentation of the data and the use of the data, and a more transparent process of access, and a simpler, more straightforward process so that all agencies would use the same process that would be spelled out by OMB. 10 of our 20, I'm not remembering, 10 of our, I think it's 21 recommendations are in a bill that passed the House and is sitting in the Senate. We're hopeful that that first set of recommendations will pass, but we're not sure what's going to happen in this environment. But I'm actively working to promote access in a safe way for the wider community.
Okay, this has been a great discussion. I really hope that you will continue to remain in touch with Bruce's work and follow it carefully. I think it's important work for the field. We are going to have another event on July 10th on the paper, one of the papers he gave us a little hint of. Is that correct, July 10th? On the issue of severe poverty and properly measuring that and accurately measuring that. And we look forward to seeing you all there as that one as well. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thanks, Robert.